Hey everyone, this is Ashley Latecki Ellenboss with Sky House Herb School and Apothecary, and today we'll be talking about how to start your own herb garden. And originally I thought, oh, I'll just do one talk. And then as I started making my notes, I was like, oh my gosh, this is a very big topic. So we will likely have two videos, maybe three on growing your own herb garden. But this first part, what we'll talk about is some of the basic ideas and things you need to consider when thinking about growing medicinal herbs. We'll also talk about things like soil and light, watering, and then sort of visioning and planning out what you want your garden to look like, feel like, and what you want it to do. What is your purpose for your garden? And then in future talks, we'll take a look at more specific plants and how to grow them. So I wanted to start off by just talking a little bit about the importance of planning a garden. And I've lived in so many different houses where I've had gardens, pretty much every house where I lived, even if I didn't, even in apartments, I would find a piece of earth in on the property that I could make into a garden, or I would have potted plants all throughout the house and I would grow herbs there. So, don't be discouraged even if you don't have a lot of space, especially if you don't have a yard and you just are sort of confined to inside growing. You can grow herbs. You can do this. We just have to think in advance and consider which plants are going to be the best fit. So that's what I hope to help you with today. So the winter time is really the time for planning the garden. We can think about it in terms of the growth cycle of plants themselves. And in the winter time, it's when all the energy is down beneath the earth. It's when all the energy and the sap is in the roots, right? So it's this time of kind of inward focus and dreaming and visioning. So if you're considering having an herb garden, this is a good time if you're listening to this in the winter. And if you're not, then that's okay. You can start anytime. But really, ideally, in the winter is when you start to create the vision of what you want your garden to look like. So I would recommend that after you listen to this talk, if you have some time, to just sit down with a notebook and jot some notes, notes based on what we've covered and what you have available to you, and also notes based on what it is you are envisioning and maybe even draw it out. And I love doing that. One of the exciting things about moving for me is like, oh, I get to create a new garden. So, you can really kind of plot it out. What do you want it to look like? And what do you want it to feel like too? I think that's important because if you just have a square plot that you dig out, it will be functional. But if you want a place where you can relax and read a book and sit with the plants, you might want to consider a different design option. Just to give you a few ideas of different design options, maybe I'll just draw them out. I've never done this before, but we'll give it a try. So in my garden back in Maryland, I had 4 raised beds, and I'm not going to be, they were actually all even. They were all evenly spaced. So this is kind of what they looked like. So this was my herb garden back in Maryland. It was 4 raised beds, and I had the middle part filled with mulch. I had a trellis here that I had hops and vines growing on. That was sort of the entryway. This was all mulch. And then I had a little bench here where you could sit and just be with the plants. And so that was a very intentional design. I wanted a place where I could sit in the garden, where I could rest, have a coat or my gloves or stuff like that. Now another, there's a lot of other garden types. You can also vision out kind of a more apothecary garden, the way that they were designed in the old monasteries, which were based more around sort of a circular approach. So I'm going to try to draw this out so you can kind of see what this might look like. And again, forgive me, I am not an artist. So I want you to imagine that these boxes are even. Basically, what I'm doing for those of you who might be listening and not being able to watch is in this diagram, there's a circle in the middle. So you have a circular garden bed in the middle, and then you can have a square or sort of like petal shape. They kind of are smaller on the inside and wider on the outside, and they kind of circle around that garden bed. And so what this does is it creates a walkway, a circular space of where you can be, and then these beds surround it. And I lived with some of my old roommates. They actually created they were in acupuncture school at then High Sophia, and I was working at the herb school, and they had a 5 element garden. So they actually had it just like this, and they had each bed represented a different element. So they had a fire, earth, water, air, and then metal. Or I think actually they had earth in the middle, but they had 5 beds and they did it by color. So they had all the red ones were the fire. In the fire plot, they had all the yellow ones, I think was for earth in the earth plot, and so on and so forth. So you can get really creative with this. You could also have a bed that is just all your mint plants. I tried that. Didn't it actually didn't work well, and I'll tell you why. But you could do it, by plant family. You can organize your beds by plant type. But through my sort of trial and error, um, one thing that I definitely learned is that, pardon, I had to rip that paper so I could draw on the back, is that when you're planning your garden, you want to be able to have, you want to know how tall things are going to get or how short they're going to remain, because it's not going to be any good for you to have a bunch of chamomile in the middle of the garden and then things like bee balm on the outside, because you'll never get to your chamomile and they'll never get sun because the bee balm will just take over. They'll be very tall and then they'll shade out the plants around them. And so, maybe this talk should be called is like what I've learned not to do in gardening and growing herbs. But you want to think about how, when you're thinking about laying them out, how big are they going to get, and are they going to shade other plants, and how are you going to be able to get to all of them? Another vision, if you're thinking more simply, if you don't have a lot of land and building a raised bed just feels like, okay, that's, outside of what I'm interested in doing, then you may want to consider, designing sort of a potted arrangement. And so I would recommend, it's really nice, I think, to have larger pots rather than a bunch of smaller pots. And the reason for that is small pots dry out quickly, and then it's a lot of watering and a lot of time and a lot of care. But if you can bundle plants that grow well together, then it's less watering, and they actually, there's beneficial relationships that a lot of plants have underground that they'll actually help each other out. So if you were to have like a few big pots where you grow herbs, I think that is a better option. So you can think about that as you're doing your visioning as well. Um, so another piece about the visioning, and this is something that I learned from Jim Duke or James Duke. He was an ethnobotanist and one of my teachers in herb school. And he had the most beautiful garden. It still exists today in Maryland, in Fulton, Maryland, called the Herbal Pharmacy. And that's FARM, pharmacy. And so Jim Duke, he was an ethnobotanist for the USDA, or no, was it for the FDA? No, I think it was for the FDA. And he basically was sent in the 1960s into the Amazon and across, all over the world to indigenous cultures to learn about medicinal plants, to bring them back for testing in the United States, which, we can have thoughts about that, in retrospect, but, at the time it was a very exciting job. And, his stories of living in the Amazon with these indigenous people, and, he's a very humble man from the South. And, he really learned and listened and paid attention to not only what plants people used, in these remote areas, but also how they related to them. And one thing he taught me was that, you know, when in his herbal garden in Maryland, he would watch people as he would give them a tour of the garden, and he would look to see which plants people were attracted to. And then he would say, he would ask them some questions. Tell me, why do you keep going back to this plant? Or what is it about this plant? And he would pay attention to that. And he said, often the plants we're attracted to are the ones that we need to heal. But he took this a step further, and he said something that I've never forgotten. He said, and I'm going to paraphrase this because I don't remember the exact quote, but basically, if you want to heal yourself, grow the plant that will help you heal it. And in the process of growing that herb, you will become healed. And that just left such a profound um, impact in me, because I found that to be true in myself over the years and in my clients and in my students. That it's one thing to take a plant that comes in a bag or in a box, but it's another to actually grow the medicine yourself and to put your time and energy and care and build a relationship with that plant. And that process of growing your medicine is a healing process in itself. And then not only, is that process happening, but then at the end of it, here you have your medicine and you've grown it from your own two hands and from the light of the sun, the nourishment of the earth, the grace of the Almighty, right? Like all of these things have come together and you've bared witness to this. So I think that's another important thing when you're thinking about growing an herbal garden is what are there any health issues you're currently working on? And seek out plants and find plants that you're really interested in and attracted to. And try to see if you can grow those along with growing plants that, I think if you're a beginner, that are also going to be really rewarding to grow because they're really easy. So I think having a mix of those two types of herbs, right? Ones that are very specific to you and your health goals, and then ones that are just easy and joyful to watch grow and have a lot of medicinal uses. So that's a little that's kind of food for thought for the visioning process of your garden. Now let's talk a bit about the nuts and bolts. Like, what are the things you need to know before you go out and start buying seeds and before you start buying little plants? The first one is you have to know your sun. How much sun are these plants going to get? Because most of our medicinal herbs need lots of sun. Most of them need between 8 and 10 hours. They're not like a house plant like these guys, which, they're pretty robust. They do pretty well with just partial sun, partial shade. Most medicinal plants really do require high sun. So you want to find a southern exposed window that you have, or southern exposed land. Look out for big tall trees, especially in the winter. This can be a little bit misleading because you look out and you're like, oh, yeah, I've got this big patch in my yard. But think about when the trees fill in, where is their shade going to be? And so, where is the path of the sun, and how does that interact with the amount of coverage from the trees? And then plot that out. So you can sort of go out on a sunny day and just sort of imagine and try to figure out, okay, where is the best place to put my plot if I'm going to be doing it outside? So again, that's a key piece. You also need to know your soil, because not all soil is the same. Really, ideally, plants like really or medicinal herbs really like rich, kind of loamy, compost full soil. Certainly there are a number of our kind of weed is not a four-letter word in my book. It is a term of endearment, but a lot of the weeds like dandelion and plantain, which are absolutely medicinal, they're fine in pretty like compact and nutrient deficient soil. So, most people don't choose to grow those in a garden, so I'm not really going to cover those, but most of the herbs that people want to grow in their gardens do require nutrient dense soil. And so you want to just check out, what is my soil like? So just dig a hole and see, do I have a lot of clay? If you do, then you might want to consider doing a raised bed, because most of our herbs are not going to do very well in clay, in very compacted clay rich soil. You also want to look at drainage. What is the drainage like? And in my past garden, we had a big area that was just swampy in the yard, and so the owners before us, it was a very very old house, had planted a bunch of daylilies and plants that love to keep their feet wet, like a lot of bulbs, irises and daylilies, and a lot of plants in the lily family. They really don't mind having soggy feet. So those were planted all in those boggy spaces, and they sort of souped and sopped up the wetness. And then I had to build my beds away from that area and build them high, because even in the springtime, it was like muddy in the yard because we lived in a very low lying area. So we want to keep an eye out for that too. Like, how much water do you have? And if you have a very muddy or low lying area, then you really probably can't grow herbs in the ground. You have to build it up. And in that case, using 2x4s and building yourself a nice bed, filling it with topsoil, and mixing it with some compost and different natural fertilizing techniques. I really love biodynamic farming. You can learn more about that. Or permaculture is another wonderful uh, way of learning how to keep your um, your soil, and sort of keep permaculture is really all about the relationships, and trying to kind of follow the natural cycles of the sun and the moon, but also following how nature replenishes itself. So, building a rain garden is something that they often do in permaculture to trap a lot of excess water. So, you want to think about that. You want to think about, what is my soil like? What is the water like? Also, if are there roads nearby? Is there any potential runoff from farmlands? Do how long have you lived there? If you haven't lived there long, was that soil treated with chemicals or things like that? So just, do a little bit of research to find that out in advance for yourself. And then you want to consider, are you going to start your plants from seed, or are you going to start them from little baby plants, little potted plants? And I will tell you from experience that some herbs will grow from seed really, really easily, and some are really, really challenging. So I would recommend, if you are a beginner grower, start with some plants that you buy from either a local herbal farm, a plant sanctuary. Try to find local resources. I know in Maryland, my favorite place where I would buy my herbs year after year is the Baltimore Herb Festival. It's usually the first week of May, June. And it's at Leakin Park in Baltimore. So last year, because of COVID, they canceled it. But hopefully this year they'll have it. But there's a lot of pop-up herb festivals where growers come in, and they'll have a wide variety of organically grown medicinal herbs that are really healthy and strong and just ready to go right into the ground or right into your pots. And so that's really the easiest way to go. Growing from seed, you do need a really good setup. You need really good light. So you need, full sun, warm window, or growing light. And there's a lot of great growing kits that you can buy with like little seed starters and overhead lights, like grow lights that you can buy. But with seeds, you have to know what the germination period is, because some seeds only take a few weeks to germinate, and some need like over a month. And some seeds even need to be planted before the last frost, so that they can have a hard freeze, and then they'll start to grow. So I'll give you some resources of where to learn about this stuff at the end of this talk, and I'll try to post them also on my YouTube channel in the description, so that you can find and see links to get to these resources. But that was something that I bought all these seeds one year, and I was like, looking through the packets of like how to grow them. And I was like, okay, this one needs a month. This one needs 2 weeks. This one needs to be sown directly into the soil. This one needs, like, like, wow, that's a lot of needs. And I was not prepared. I didn't have all the things set up for that. So this is why when if you're going to go the seed route, the benefit of growing things from seed, there's a few. One is that it's way less expensive than buying potted plants because of obviously all the resources that go into growing them. Also, if you get really good quality organic seeds and heirloom seeds, where you know exactly, that they are from like an heirloom variety of the plant, and they're not, genetically modified in any way, then you absolutely know your source. You can control the soil that they grow in, you can control the light. It's also really fun because they're babies. They're so cute and they're just these little tiny sprouts and they have those first little leaves that come up. So, it's a joyful process to grow from seed, but it takes a lot of time and care. So like if you're, planning on going on vacation, don't start seeds because they need you to water them, pretty regularly. Um, so what else? So once you've kind of visioned out what you want your space to look and feel like, once you've assessed your surroundings and you've figured out, do these plants like full sun? Do they need partial sun? Because I will say that, again, most herbs need full sun, but there are some that do okay with part shade. So, you can do some research and maybe in the next talk, I'll give you guys a list of those. But, you want to think about all of that and think about how much space you actually have and what's available. And then um, you have to start choosing the herbs and thinking about your timeline. So again, your timeline really is your visioning and planning and seed buying really should happen December, January, February. Those are really your times to be buying seeds and planning things out. Once you hit March, I would say February, March is when you want to start planting your indoor seeds, and these are ones that that have a long germination period. And you also need them to be strong enough so that you can plant them in the soil, and then rain and wind and animals won't just crush them. So February is a good time to start your seeds in pots or under grow lights. And then, if you have things that need to be sown in the earth, then you want to put those in, that need a frost. You want to start putting those in like March, right? Um, Now, if you're going to be buying plants like, little potted plants that are already, a good 4 to 5 inches, 6 inches tall, that are ready to just go in the ground, you want to buy those closer to the last frost of your area. Now, I know in Maryland, for many years, it was Mother's Day, which is in May. That was sort of the last frost. But in the last 5 years, that's actually gotten earlier, that there's been really no frosts in early May. So you can really start planting most of your plants like at the end of April, or early May. But you do want to check with your zone and just see. And you can use the Farmer's Almanac too. That's a great resource, which I'll send a link, I'll add a link for that too. And the Farmer's Almanac, you can sign up for their newsletters and they'll tell you exactly in your zone when to plant all of your vegetables, when to plant your herbs, when to plant your annuals, when, it kind of gives you a sense of timing, structure, and patterns. And it's, based on the old Farmer's Almanac, which is very much based in sun and moon cycles. So let me now change gears and I'm going to talk about the best starting place for growing your herbs, and the best plant family to start with. And that will end our first talk. And then we'll pick up and I think talk a little bit more about planting with the moon cycles. And in the second talk, we'll look at other plant families. So the easiest plant family to start with is the mint family. This is the Lamiaceae family. And this is the family that houses most of our most common and well-loved and most highly valuable medicinal herbs because they have such broad range of use of use and uses. So the Lamiaceae or the mint family plant family includes herbs like rosemary, peppermint, mountain mint, lemon balm, oregano, thyme, basil, holy basil, sage, all of the culinary plants, or most of the culinary plants, and then a lot of our very aromatic plants as well. Now, lavender is in this family, but that one's a little trickier to grow. Lavender actually does better in pots, or if you do want to plant lavender, it needs a sandy bottom. It really hates having wet feet. So does rosemary. So this was a trick I learned from my mom, is if you dig a very deep hole in your garden and fill it with sand, and then put some soil, and then put your rosemary or your lavender plant, it will be very happy. And my mom has had this incredible lavender plant. Usually in Maryland, they die off in the winter, but hers has been around and it comes back every year bigger and bigger. I think it's been alive now for 6 or 7 years, and it's just like, it's huge. So, that's a really good way of, growing those two mint family plants. Or if you have a pot, make sure you add a lot of rocks to the bottom of it so you can make sure that it drains really, really well. But for, most of our mint family plants, they do fine in any sort of pot, really in the ground, just about anywhere, as long as they have sun. And they'll tell you when they want to be watered. I mean, they get like really dramatic. They're like, and they start wilting, and you're like, okay. And you water them, and they're like, okay, I'm fine. It's like, okay, kind of like peace lilies. Peace lilies are like very dramatic too. They like wilt and then they come right back. So, they're pretty forgiving, I will say. Like if you're looking for an indoor plant, peace lilies are very forgiving, and mint family plants are quite forgiving too. So here are a few things about growing plants in the mint family. Number one, most of them have runners. Their roots spread underground and they will take off, and you will be amazed at how far they will go. I mean, I've had mint plants pop up. I showed you a picture of, this was my garden, and, each of these beds was probably like, I think they were like 3 feet by 5 or 6 feet. And I had most of my mints contained in this bed, and I found one that jumped all the way over to the middle of this bed. And I was like, how did you get there? And it's underground is how they get there, really. I mean, because I could see the root. I was like, traced it all the way back to the edge of the bed. So a tip for growing mints, especially peppermint and lemon balm, and thyme and rosemary too, or thyme and oregano too, is to grow them in a container in the earth. So if you can find, I don't love plastic, but it does work well for this purpose, is you have to have holes in the bottom of the big, large plastic pot. I guess you could use metal and drill holes in them too. That might work as well. But just be careful that it's not like aluminum. It'd have to be something that will not leach into the soil. But a large pot filled with soil, you put the plant in, it's got drainage on the bottom, and then you don't bury it all the way underground, but you leave a little bit of that rim of the plastic up above ground, and that'll keep the roots in that space. And it'll actually kind of force the plant to get bigger and bushier and happier and healthier. And you can throw a little mulch over it if you don't like having the plastic rim up, but you don't want to have that plastic rim below the soil. Otherwise, the plant roots will escape, and then trust me, they'll be everywhere. And that's fun for a little while until you have to control it, and then you realize what a mess it's become. So those plants grow well in pots. So if you're considering, okay, I just want to have a few big pots, and that's going to be my herb garden this year, then go for it. Buy some big. I like terracotta pots because they do dry out quickly, but they also are natural material and biodegradable. So you can, just buy a few really large ones and plant all of your mints in there. I think the ones that work really well in a group like that would be peppermint, lemon balm, oregano, and thyme. If you're going to pick four, I like five. Five and seven are like kind of my favorite numbers to when I'm thinking about planting. So you could do five. So maybe you add in a little bit of basil. Right. And again, consider how much space you have. So you need to, You don't want to cram them in. The nice thing is when you buy plants that are little babies, is that the little tag in there will tell you how much space they need between plants. And so you do want to pay attention to that because plants are usually not happy if they're too close together. They'll get crowded out. So, you know, think about think about how much space each of them are going to need, and maybe you just put three in your big pot to start. That's fine, absolutely too. Um, the other nice thing about mint family plants is that they're perennial. They'll come back year after year. And so a lot of times, when I was growing my mint family plants in pots, I would just bring them inside over the winter and have them in a sunny window. And then in the spring, I'd bring them outside. And in the winter, they're not as happy. I mean, they kind of die back. Don't be surprised if they start to lose leaves and brown and yellow. Keep watering them, not as regularly, like water them every 2 weeks, and just sort of know they're in their wintering phase. But trust me, if you don't completely stop watering them for too long, they'll die back. But then as soon as they're outside in that full sun, they'll come back, and then you'll have all those medicines to make teas and tinctures and to cook with. And it's quite delightful to have those plants with you and to see them grow and to watch their life cycle. And then I think the last thing I'll say for this talk before we close is that when you're planting an outdoor garden, always plant a little bit more than what you think you need because you want to give some back to the earth. And what I mean is that, when you're, especially with food, if you're growing like strawberries or blueberries, that birds and squirrels and animals are going to come and eat part of them, and insects too. So, I always, I never get mad at the bugs or the animals that eat my food. I just think, well, this is their, like they live here too. So when I was planting my garden, I bought like 5 chamomile plants because I was like, okay, I want to have enough here to where, whoever else wants to take them, which there were some really lovely uh, uh, what were they? Monarch butterflies that love to eat the chamomile, and they love to eat my rue. So I had enough rue and enough chamomile to let them have some, and then for me to have enough too. So the nice thing though is that a lot of medicinal herbs, unlike food growing, a lot of medicinal herbs have enough phytochemicals that bugs and herbivores will not eat them. So, you won't have a lot of, there's not a lot of munching happening on most medicinal plants because of their high volatile oil or alkaloid content. So that's kind of nice. I think it is a good idea to just, think generously when you're planning it out. So I'll leave us there, and I'd love to hear your questions. What questions do you have about what we talked about? What would you like to hear more about in future herb growing talks? I know we're just getting started here, but I'd love to hear, what other topics would be of interest to you, and I'll do my best to answer them or to give you other resources where you can find those answers. So thanks for listening. Happy garden dreaming and planning, and I will see you all again soon.